we've been celebrating that auspicious move to Spring Grove from Vestre Toten, Norway, several times. And we began a series of Glasrud dogs, which simply means, by English translation, the day of the Glasruds. If you ask the Norwegians, they'll tell you that's wrong, but trust me, that's what it means. Glasrud dag means the day of the Glasruds. And we've been having these days of the Glasrud about every 3 years, starting back in 1981. I'm going to ask Leonard maybe to comment about that. I got in on a little bit of that reunion, but he also believes there may have been one before that.
I think Bill Lee, Knut Lee, and Ted Glasrud, they're both deceased now, that they met in the late 70s and probably had a planning session, and I think, as you remember, Ted was very instrumental in getting Glasrud's dog started, and I think there was probably just a meeting of a few relatives that got this initiated, and then probably decided that in '81 would be the first one in Rochester, which I know I attended. And were you at that one?
We didn't get to the Saturday part of it. We came Sunday afternoon because of another family conflict, but it was at that Glasrud reunion, they called it at that point. Glasrud dog had not been born.
Yeah.
But it was at that point that they sort of decided we should meet on a fairly regular basis. And it began from that. Diane and I were looking last night at the original registration sheet that was handwritten by our aunt Olga in that beautiful Palmer method of handwriting that they all learned when they were going to school here in Spring Grove, all of the Glasrud girls together, your mother and my mother and Aunt Olga Matheson and the others. But she had a very scripted, handwritten, beautiful penmanship. Every single person who attended, how much money that they had paid for their lunch and their dinner and so forth. There are no notes about what else happened, but there was one momentous event that night. Ted Glasrud has been a generous benefactor of the family over the years. Along with Knut Lee and a couple others, decided that we ought to have a foundation. Well, and Ted put up the money for it, $25,000. Unfortunately, it never went anyplace, largely because you didn't have a reason for it. They didn't have any purpose behind it. They just thought that the Glasruds ought to be remembered somewhere along the line. But so then, in 1981, it was in the first of the Glasrud dogs. 1984.
1984 was my first one.
Yeah, that was in La Crosse, wasn't it?
It was in La Crosse.
La Crosse.
And your dad was here, wasn't he? He came.
My dad came from Montana.
Yeah, and Ray and Linda, your cousin, Tom and my third cousin, you're our third cousin, came from Alberta for that one, because that's when I first met Ray. And a little side note, in '81, we had a cousin, Diane Finbo, who had just been to Europe with his family and met the Norwegian cousins that have since come several times. And prior to that, Ray Glasrud, Diane's first cousin, had been to Norway and made contact. And it's strictly through accident that we in the lower 48 found out about it, because my brother David had written some letter to the editor in a farm publication, and a Glasrud from Saskatchewan, it was Cecil Glasrud, be Ray's father.
Ray's father.
Had written to my brother David and said, I think we're related to the Myras. And David gave the letter to my mother, who would be Cecil's second cousin, and they started communicating. And later, prior to '81, they'd written to my mother and said that their son Ray had been in Norway and made contact with the Glasruds, and it happened just before Diane in early '81 had gone to Norway. And so my mother called and said, we've discovered Glasruds. And so they went to the Paul and Elsa Glasrud's farm, and so they came back and gave a report, and since then they've been back and forth several times. Ray told me that when he finally got to the Glasrud farm in Toten, he knocked on the door, and Paul's father, who was still alive at the time, Ray introduced himself and said, I'm a Glasrud from North America, and Paul's father said, we've known we've had relatives in North America, we were just wondering when they're going to show up.
And there they did.
And Ray gave him a can of Copenhagen, which he really appreciated, so he could have some U.S. snuff.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I found out about Glasrudag not from my cousin Ray from Canada, but from signing in at an athletic club, and the name ahead of me was Rob Glasrud. And I knew about Ted, because Ted was famous in Minneapolis, but I'd never seen this name Rob Glasrud, so I made the connection. He's a senior in high school, and he had the flyer from the 1981 reunion, and I just missed it.
There are Glasruds all over the place.
Yeah.
And most of them are related.
Yeah. Well, the Glasrud name is kind of unique, so they would be related.
Yeah.
But it was kind of interesting because Ray from Canada is finding out all of this at about approximately the same time that I was finding out about it from a completely different source. So it was, 84 before we realized that we each knew the same information. But.
Well, Ray was really the one who discovered, because he told me that before he went, he worked for the oil companies as a biologist, and he had business in Norway, and he told me before he left for Norway, he asked his dad, Cecil, what can you tell me about Norway? And he said, all I know is Toten, the word Toten, he said. And they'd been, his dad had been born and grown up in the Saskatchewan out of Canada, so he wasn't familiar with the Glasrud like we are here in Spring Grove, the historical perspective. But he had time, and he found Toten, and he found the Glasrud farm, and so and then he kind of, the word got down here that, that they'd been discovered, and they probably regretted it ever since.
We'll talk a little bit more about Vestertoten. In 1984 and 1987, we had Glasrudags, and sort of began at that point to establish a pattern of a formula of how these reunions should take place. And because we had so many family members from other parts of the country, we felt that we had to work a little bit in making sure that everybody was comfortable. Ted Glasrud, and we'll talk a little bit about some of our seniors now gone. They finished their work here on Earth. Ted met with us and his son, Ted Jr., and the committee, and we used to advertise ourselves as the committee, whomever they are, because we never wanted to identify ourselves. But we met with Ted Sr., and he said, make sure that these Glasrud reunions are always available to everybody in the family so that they can always come. And he said, don't worry about the cost. Now, he was a very wealthy man, and it was easy for him to say that, but he was very generous with that, and he just, no strings attached. He just said, plan the reunion, price it so that everybody can come to the reunion, and I'll make up the difference. Well, for a couple of reunions, he did indeed make up a difference for us. It wasn't significant because we're frugal Norwegians, and we never went overboard, but we always had a good time. I remember one of the early reunions that Diane was a part of we had it in La Crosse. And maybe that was 84 or 87.
87.
87, and we had a hot air balloon, and some of our, I can remember when great aunt Sigrid Voller got in the balloon. She was about in her 80s at the time. She hiked up her skirt and hauled in that basket. She wasn't going to be missing out. We had what else did we
have? It was an organ grinder with a monkey. That was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think. There was the tree. There was an open-sided meeting area, and
it was at Myrick Park.
Myrick, yeah, and the tree was there, and people were coming over and filling in some names on the tree. But I think that was my first chance to meet the Norwegians, and they danced for us. It was just a small group of them danced for us.
Yeah.
I remember that. It was wonderful. I'd never seen that before.
Arnie and Eva Glasrud and Paul Glasrud are relatives from Norway. The first time that they had come and joined us at a Glasrudag was at Myrick Park. And Arnie put on a cowboy hat and gave a speech in Norwegian to all of us, which we had to have one of the members of the family translate for us. But he was very animated. That relationship with our Norwegian cousins was cemented at that point. They extended invitations for us to come, and in 1990, members of my immediate family, my 7 brothers and sisters and us, all went to Norway and were greeted by that Glasrud family and treated like returning heroes. I was a
Royalty.
Royalty. It was yeah. And Sigrid always thought we were from royalty, but
Yeah.
some of the rest of us wondered which jail we were locked up in too.
Yeah.
Well, I remember your brother-in-law, Doug, old son, married to Helen, saying that, you know, I had tears in my eyes. He said, I'm not even Norwegian. He said.
It was a marvelous event. We had one in Decorah, and I think that was in '91.
I think so, yeah, because
Yeah.
that's the year Engen came and lived with us for a year, and remember Paul and Engen came, and Elsa didn't come that year.
Yeah.
And
91 in Decorah was what my everlasting memory was, that park where we went, and we had all the games and tents out there, and basically we were on a hill. So when everybody was out there running as part of the games, we were running either uphill or downhill, and then there was a few.
We were back in La Crosse in '94.
Back in La Crosse.
okay.
Pettibone Island, when we had the canoe races, the boat races,
Okay.
and we had the run in the morning. 1997, we were here in Spring Grove
Homecoming.
because it was homecoming, and that was a big event. We were able to participate in the parade. We had a float where we had, in fact, we had some of our Norwegian cousins on the float with their bunads on. Eva had her bunad on. In 1997, after homecoming parade here, then we went out to David Myra's farm, where they had set up a big tent, and they had animals, small animals for the children to play with, and then the big wind came up that afternoon. We had one of our relatives, David Ford, was putting on a magic show, and like I said, he almost got blown all the way to Winnebago County. So we quick ate, packed up, and headed back for our respective hotels and homes because it was a
thunderstorm.
Well, it was bad. It was major. People scrambled. People ran without their anything, without their
But
coats.
then afterwards it quieted down, and I guess David stayed there and put on a show for the kids that did come back. And
Yes.
So I guess they had a good time.
Sure.
yeah.
But,
Going back to year 2000, that was the highest attendance we had ever had at that point. We had over 300 people at that reunion
was that it?
in 2000,
That was nice.
and I think that was in Lanesboro.
330, I think, was our final
Yeah,
numbers.
It was
and
It was the word had spread. That was the first time we had a little golf tournament along with it. We had just a grand time. We had all those games down in the field. And
Was that the first time that you put together the church service? You had...
we'd had a service before, but we had attended Trinity Lutheran. Diane had brought up the question of 2003 being a very special and significant day or year in the history of Glasrud. It would be the 150th anniversary of the immigration of our common ancestor, Christian Glasrud, to the United States. He came here in 1853. Diane, I'm going to hold you accountable for this, said, we need to do something really special in 2003. And she brought up the idea of maybe we should have a return reunion in Toten, Norway. And I said, you got to be kidding. We won't get anybody to fly all the way over to Norway. And will they have us? Well, we had had the experience as a family in 1990 of taking 17 of us over there. And it was just a wonderful reception. And so we thought, well, let's just test the water. So
we started planning it. You suggested Brekkie travel, because I actually think the Brekkies live in Norway part of the year. And they did an absolutely incredible job bringing people from all over. and getting them there within a day or a half a day of each other. And you could take a 1-week trip, just do the weekend events, or you could stay on the 10-day trip. So it was, it's almost hard to describe how terrific that was.
On the tour, on the Breckie tour itself, we had about 150. Then we had another 25 or 30 who traveled independently of us, but joined us for the reunion itself for the 3 days. The Lee family, Bob Lee and his family, traveled independently.
We did.
The
You
Joneses.
did, Leonard did, and
The Joneses.
the Joneses.
Yeah.
But we had, we rode down those roads with 5 great big buses and pulled in, and, well, I'll quickly tell the story. We got everybody hooked up one way or another, and we discovered we had about 175 to 180 Americans going to show up in Norway. In the meantime, the Norwegians were planning their part of the story, which was all be together. And we went to Vigeland Park, and we went to a couple of other places, stayed at the Grand Hotel, which was lovely, and we had also agreed that we were going to have a choir. There's a lot of music in the Glasruds, and we were going to have a choir sing at our church service the following Sunday. And so my daughter Mary was going to be the director. She put out a call for volunteers, and about 43 of the members of the family showed up. And we needed to have a rehearsal. Well, they didn't have a place in the hotel for us to rehearse, but they said we could stand in the lobby. So we stood in the lobby of the Grand Hotel in Oslo, Norway, and rehearsed. And there were people, other guests of the hotel, standing around the outside edges and listening to us sing. And it was quite an event. And there was one man who had his hand high in the air with his cell phone. And he was talking to his relative in Copenhagen, Denmark. And he said, "You got to hear this." So he held this up through about a 4-minute part of a rehearsal and listened. And he was standing next to a brother-in-law who wasn't singing with us, but he said, "Well, what are you doing?" And the guy said in perfect English, he said, "I wanted my relative in Copenhagen to hear this beautiful music." So we had rehearsal there, but then we had these other tours, and things really went very well. On the first day of the actual reunion, we moved from Oslo to Lillehammer first.
Lillehammer.
So we saw so we did the typical tourist things. And then we moved to Gjøvik and moved into a hotel there, and on the 3rd of July, I think it was, or the 4th of July, 4th of July, we had a banquet where we invited the host family from Norway to join us. We had a couple of interlopers who traveled with us on that trip who weren't Glasruds, but they're wannabes. They're related to us on the other side of the family, and so we had a ceremony inducting them into the world of the Glasruds. We sang our national anthem because it was the 4th of July, and then we all together sang Ja vi elsker, the Norwegian national anthem. It was a beautiful night. It was not a lot of speeches, just a lot of camaraderie, a lot of wonderful times. The next day, the buses picked us up at Gjøvik, and then we went to the farm. Did you remember the day at the farm?
Well, yeah, we rolled up in the buses, and our tour guide, Mariana, in our bus, was explaining how each home on the side of the road was built as the family expanded. And then we got to the main house, and they parked the buses, and we all started walking in, and it was just like, I'd been there before, but I know I've never been there before. Yeah. And it was just beautiful farm, just beautiful countryside. And they had put a border all the way around their barn, and I think it was construction paper, and they had put all of the family tree on that construction paper, and it wrapped all the way around the barn. And again, people were going up and adding children and grandchildren, and my husband was just astonished. He walked around just jaw-dropping at this effort that they made to circle the barn with the whole family tree. And the banquet that we had that day, the picnic that we had that day, and taking tours of their home, and just realizing that, you know, that's where Christian left from.
And of course, the banquet that night on the hill overlooking Lake Nyosa.
Oh,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've got a picture of that that's built, that whole group of people. I don't know if anybody's ever counted the number in that picture.
You'd probably need a magnifying glass.
300, I mean,
Over
we
300.
brought 150 plus, and there was over 150 plus Glasrud relatives from there.
That evening, after the picture was taken, we had dinner. We had a couple of commentaries from some folks, the Norwegians welcoming us and the Americans thanking them for their hospitality. Then we still had Sunday ahead of us, which was just, you just can't imagine how warm that was. It was just incredible. We had this family choir up in one balcony, and we had the Beaverbrew Marching Corps, the Norwegians band. Paul Glasrud played clarinet in that band. We're used to having a full house at church when you have a special event like that, but the Norwegians aren't very used to that. And there was a young family that was going to have their child baptized that day. So they showed up at this church, and they couldn't find a place to sit. They had to sit way up in the front because all the rest of the pews were taken. We've often remarked, I wonder what that family thought, coming to church on the 5th of July in the summer, expecting to have the pastor and maybe the sexton and 2 other people attending, and have a full house, and literally packed to the gills. We couldn't have gotten any more people in.
Baptism for their child.
Oh yeah, and in attendance was the former bishop of Norway,
Araflat.
Araflat. Johannes Araflat, who's a member of the Glasrud family. His mother was a Glasrud. That was the biggest reunion in a lot of ways. We got into a series of reunions in Lanesboro, and Lanesboro provided a wonderful setting for us to do. You know, it's really a town built for.
Yeah, with Eagle Bluff for our banquets, and then they had the theater, and it's close to Vesterheim and
Plenty of housing.
So, plenty of housing. So, and we had a few of the elderly relatives live in Rochester area, but they could come for during the day and go home at night. So, it was it's been a very convenient location for us. So.
The history of the Glasruds included a very strong involvement with particularly the Lutheran Church, and particularly here in Spring Grove and Blackhammer and the immediate communities around. As the family grew and moved out and spread all over the United States, so did their faith practice. And so we felt that inviting everybody to go to a Lutheran service when they had all these different faith practices was probably not as appropriate as we wanted it to be, because we wanted everybody to be a part. And so we did an ecumenical service, and the first one we had was at the Fest House here.
That's right.
And that was probably in '97 that we did that. Because well, no, it could have been in 2000, but it was a big reunion. Thanks for bringing that up.
No, that was very, very wonderful to have that before the brunch. I mean, that was just such a great addition. And I do remember being in the Lutheran church here, and I don't know if we actually organized that or it was just word of mouth, but that little boy George was being baptized, and so
That's right.
yeah, so we all wanted to be there, and I think that was kind of not totally impromptu, but
my sister's grandson was being baptized, and they lived in California. They came, the whole family came for the reunion.
Would that be 97 or 2000?
I'm pretty sure it was 97.
Yeah. Well, that's right. That was kind of a special. I had brought people to the church service.
Yeah. We've continued that practice of having an ecumenical church service. We call on members of the family. We have had in the past members of the family who are clergy, But that hasn't stopped us when they weren't here. So we had a service anyway. And that became another part of the formula that we were talking about earlier. We'd arrive Friday night and get together with no specific plan in mind. Saturday mornings we would have some kind of a recreation, and we would have registration, and people would pick up their shirts with some of the mementos that we had, the teddy bears and the pictures that we took and so forth. Saturday afternoon we always had games for the kids. That was part of the tradition. Saturday night was always the big event where we had a banquet. In most cases we get all dressed up for it. It was in 1994 in La Crosse at one of those banquets that we call it The Book was introduced. Glasrud, A Family History, it was written by another member of our extended family. His name was Socrates. We called him Sock. And his brother Baldy was Baldwin. But Sock's real name was Clarence Glasrud, and he and his wife together took on the job in the late 80s of putting together a definitive history of Glasruds. He had thought it was going to be the Glasruds coming from the Peter Anton family going forward, but actually he wasn't a part of it because his father was Klaus Glasrud, the youngest of those Glasruds from Christian Glasrud's family, and was born here in the United States. Sock, or Clarence, was a professor at Moorhead State, and he put together this book that even today is used almost weekly, certainly in our house, when somebody says, "Remember Aunt Matilda? Well, when was she born?" "Well, she was born in thus and such a day." And when did she marry Canute Lee? And that kind of, so we could find all of those stories, and they did a wonderful job of blending not only the statistical data, birth dates and so forth, but individual stories about people. So those books are tucked away in people's houses all over the United States and in Norway, which tells the story of the Glasruds up until 1994, which is when it was published. We've obviously changed since then. Many of the heroes of our family, the Canute Lees and the Bill Lee, the Robert E. A. Lees and the Ted Glasruds and the Sock Glasruds and the others in the family, George Glasrud, our uncle, have left us. But they've left us a legacy that we continue to enjoy.
There's quite enough love for one like me, and in this very room there's quite enough joy for one like me, and there's quite enough hope and quite enough power to chase away any gloom. Lord Jesus, Lord Jesus is in this very room, and in this very room there's quite enough love for one like me, and in this very room there's quite enough joy for all the world, and there's quite enough hope and quite enough power to change